Legend has it that when the great Indian leader Mahatma Gandhi was asked what he thought about Western civilization, he replied, "I should think it would be a very good idea." Like Jesus, Gandhi had little tolerance for cultural arrogance or religious hypocrisy. "I like your Christ," Gandhi once said. "I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." Like Gandhi, Jesus had no problem with religion as long as that religion was actually put into practice. But an awful lot of Jesus' teaching back then was to go after his people who he believed were not practicing properly the faith of their fathers. That's why I think he so often is on the attack against hypocrites who would profess to believe very deeply, but actually live their life in a very different way. Do your faith, Jesus says. Go out and do it. That's really what the Luke's parable here of the Good Samaritan is all about. Breaking down our prejudices, eliminating stereotypes, understanding that loving our neighbor may not be as easy as taking a plate of brownies down the street. It might mean loving someone very different from ourselves. I have to admit right off the bat that I used to be a little bit prejudiced. I couldn't help it. I was raised that way in North Carolina. Was told that Yankees were rude, especially New Yorkers. And I had visited New York a couple of times, and they did not prove me wrong. That's why I loved getting to hear Paul read again today. I love your accent, Paul. I'll never forget my first Christmas here in Connecticut when Paul read the Nativity story, spoke the words of the great multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Goodwill towards men." See, when I grew up down in North Carolina, the readers would say, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men." Will is a couple of syllables, My point is, when I graduated college and my good friend Dorothy moved up here to New York City from North Carolina, she was going to NYU Film School, and I was just a little bit afraid for her. You know, a Southern belle alone in the big city, you just never knew what might happen. Well, turns out what happened one night was this. It was a dark and stormy night in Manhattan. Snow and ice were making the sidewalks slippery and dangerous. Dorothy was getting out of her film class a little past 10 o'clock at night and heading for the subway that would take her back to her apartment in Brooklyn. There weren't many other people around, and those that were around were kind of sketchy characters, mostly young men who might or might not be gang members. They certainly were hanging around together and looking kind of surly. Or maybe homeless drug addicts lining the corridors down there at the bottom. So in any case, she made a real point of hurrying past them all, not making eye contact, crossing as far to the other side of the stairwell as she could to keep her distance. And that's where she said it probably caused her, all this kind of dance of avoidance probably is what caused her to miss the top stair and tumble head over heels all the way down to the bottom. Well, when I heard her tell me that, I was horrified. After all I had learned about inner city violence, I figured she might have lain there, neglected and alone for days, or even gotten beaten and robbed to the bargain. But what she told me was a complete surprise. It turns out a couple of well-dressed strangers did pass her by in a hurry as the train was just pulling into the station, didn't want to miss their train. But these very shabby guys that she had been avoiding did come and surround her immediately. But turns out, surrounded her to see if she was okay. And she wasn't. She thought she might have broken her leg because she couldn't exactly stand. And when they saw how bad off she was, they immediately offered to go call an ambulance. Remember the days before cell phones? But she said she wanted to just do her best to get home and see how she felt the next morning. But they wouldn't leave her alone to try to wait for the next train. They were too afraid of her falling and getting hurt worse. So they insisted on calling her a cab, even though she didn't have the money for a cab. And this was before, taxis would accept credit cards. So one of the guys went running off looking for a payphone while the rest of the gang started digging in their pockets for enough cash to put together to pay for the car service. And among all of them, including Dorothy, they managed to scrape together the $20 or so that she needed. And she tried to get them to give her their addresses so she could pay them back later, but they wouldn't hear of it. She said later she wondered if it might have been because they didn't have any other address than the subway station. So in case it's not obvious while I'm telling you the tales of my friend Dorothy, I thought it was an awful lot like this parable of the Good Samaritan, in that it really upsets our prejudices and surprises us when people we didn't think were very good turn out to be full of graciousness and goodness. Back in the time of Jesus, you see, Samaritans were the last people anyone would have expected to be helpful or kind. They were hated by the Jews and vice versa. And the reason was they were descendants of the Israelites, the Samaritans were, from the northern kingdom, those who had remained behind on the land at the time of the Assyrian conquest some 700 years before Jesus, when most of the leading families of the time had been deported into slavery by the Assyrians. Centuries later now, the Jews saw them as a new and impure mixed race, since many of these Samaritan families had been formed as the Israel's lower classes intermarried with foreign settlers brought in by the Assyrians. But the Samaritans didn't see themselves that way as Gentiles. They continued to follow the Torah, and they built their own temple on Mount Gerizim. A temple, by the way, that only 100 years before Jesus' time, a Judean leader had destroyed, and so increased even more the hatred between Judeans and Samaritans, north and south all over again. You see, we've become so comfortable with the phrase, the Good Samaritan, there's even an entire body of law out there to protect Good Samaritans who help people by the side of the road. None of us here has probably ever heard of a bad Samaritan. Wouldn't make sense. But for the original Jewish listeners to this parable, they never would have expected that ending of the Samaritan being a good guy. To a good Jew, the Samaritan was probably the usual suspect, as they say, someone who would be first in line to attack him if he were to walk along that dangerous road from Jerusalem down to Jericho. It was a place, that Jericho road, a lot like a New York subway.